what is its message? What is it trying to describe? So, as you may have seen in the list, the title of this song is called Strange Fruit. Give you a hint, the title is a metaphor. We are not literally looking into a song about fruit. That is a metaphor for something, so try and think about what strange fruit could be. Now, this was originally a poem. It was written by Abel Meeropol, and then it was turned into a song and sung by Billie Holiday around the same time that our book is set, around the same time of To Kill a Mockingbird. So these are the lyrics to the song. Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Pastoral scene of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth, scent of magnolias, sweet and fresh, then the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here is fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rot, for the trees to drop. Here is a strange and bitter crop. Okay, so right off the get-go, I'm sure that you have some ideas. There are some clues here, literal things: blood on the leaves, blood at the root. This is the most overt clue: black bodies swinging in the southern breeze. This song was written to describe the phenomena of lynching. If you haven't heard that particular term before, I have a definition on the next page I'll get to in a moment, but lynching was an illegal execution. It is something that we don't often hear about in our modern times, but it was something that was unfortunately quite common back in the Great Depression times, in post-Civil War times, and it predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly affected people of color. So in this poem, which was turned into a song, as I mentioned, the author was trying to write about this phenomena, this lynching phenomena that was affecting so many people, many of them completely innocent of whatever crimes they may have been suspected of, but trying to describe it in a way that would make people think, that wouldn't just make them angry, wouldn't just make them shut down. They would hear this song and wonder and put things together and realize that the strange fruit are the people. Because normally when we think about fruit hanging from trees, fruit belongs on trees. It grows there. It's life. It is life growing there, and it is giving life to us when we consume it as food. But this fruit that's hanging from the trees, it is strange. It is wrong. It is immoral that this fruit would be hanging predominantly on southern trees. And I'll be showing you a map soon of the areas that were most affected by lynchings. It is not an exclusively southern problem, but it did predominantly affect the South, as you'll see momentarily. Okay. So throughout the song, throughout the poem, we have these images of the South, beautiful images, pastoral scene of the gallant South, because the South is a beautiful, wonderful place. But within this wonderful place at this time, there were people hanging from trees, and their eyes were bulging out, and their mouth was twisted with pain. You could smell beautiful flowers off in the distance, but you could also smell burning flesh. Some people were burned at the stake instead of hanged, and that is still considered lynching, any illegal execution. So this crop that was cropping up all over the South, Abel Meeropol, Billie Holiday, the people who gave attention and promoted this song, they said this needs to stop. This is murder. This is wrong, and this needs to stop. So that was the purpose of this song. So the next thing that I have, and this is trigger warning part, I have a slideshow, and the song will play in the background, and I'll try to give a little bit of volume so that you can hear it. It will be a little bit echoey. It's very old-fashioned and jazzy, probably not music that you're into, but you'll be able to hear it a little bit and know what the words are, even if you can't hear it very clearly. The images that are going to show in the slideshow have the map that I mentioned, and then after that, I have images of lynchings. They are in black and white, and because they were, taken a very long time ago, the photos are not high quality, but I think it'll definitely give you an idea of what happened there, of who carried out these lynchings. And I'll talk more about the photographs after. If you are not comfortable viewing these photographs, then just skip ahead a little bit and you can hear me talk about them without having to see those images if they disturb you. Okay. Um, if you watch that, I'm sure that you noticed some common themes amongst those images that were shown. Um, as I mentioned, lynchings were illegal. They were carried out by a mob, typically not by law enforcement. Law enforcement could be complicit or they could just be overwhelmed or unaware, but typically it was a mob. We associate lynching most often with hanging, but it can also be shooting, burning at the stake. There was one image of a man who had been burned almost beyond recognition as he was killed. And typically, lynchings were used to punish an alleged transgressor, someone who was believed to have done something wrong. Now, wrong that could be a crime, or it could just be a social violation. Lynching was also used to intimidate, control, or manipulate a population of people. Lynching became more frequent when there was social and economic tension, and of course, there's been no time in our history of more economic tension, perhaps, than the Great Depression. And lynching was used by the politically dominant population to oppress social challengers. Now, since Reconstruction, which is post-Civil War, lynching was a common weapon against African Americans seeking to exercise the liberties provided by the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. Now, the 14th Amendment of the Constitution gave people of color the right to vote. But even though it was in the Constitution, it should be an inalienable right, there was still a lot of pressure at the local level in some states, in some areas of the United States, to make exercising that right incredibly difficult. In order to vote, you have to register to vote. That process was made unimaginably difficult with tests that didn't make sense and poll taxes and all sorts of obstacles. And sometimes when it came down to it, lynching to say, hey, you better stay in your lane, you better stay in your place where you belong, and don't try to get too high and mighty. Now I'm sure you noticed that the victims of these lynchings in those photographs, they were predominantly Black, and the mobs surrounding those victims were, of course, predominantly white. Another thing that I want you to think about as you think back to those mobs that you saw, because our eyes are drawn to the violence and the suffering of what happened to these victims, but the people who are there in these photographs with them, I was struck as I looked at them, as I collected these photographs, by how normal these people looked. They aren't standing there in Ku Klux Klan white robes. It's not even all men. I mean, in these images, there are women, there are children at these lynchings. So it was unexpected to see how kind of average these people looked. I would never, walk around a street and see these people and think they are a threat. They could, watch someone die. They could help kill a person. They look so innocuous. And I also want to emphasize that the reason that we have these photographs, it's not because there was some, person in the woods like, oh, I must take a picture of this and show people the terrible things that are happening. The people in these photographs posed for these pictures. They published them as postcards. That is how powerful these people are. I mean, if you want to talk about intimidation and control, they had so much invincibility in these towns, in these situations, that they could pose for a photograph next to a person they had just illegally murdered and nothing would happen to them. So if you can imagine being a person of color growing up in places like these where lynchings like this might occur, how could you rise up against forces like this? How could you try to, take some sort of action that would be considered inappropriate by this group of people? It would be terrifying. You'd be risking your life every time you did something like that. So, many people in these places lived in fear. They lived in fear that if they didn't do what they were supposed to do and act the way that they were supposed to act and follow the Jim Crow laws to the letter, then they might end up on a postcard someday. So, anyways, it's definitely gets me upset. But there's one particular photograph that I want to talk about, and I do have it on this page. Sorry, should have warned you. But mostly what you can see in this photograph are the people in the crowd. This particular lynching photograph is probably the most famous photograph of all time. It is the photograph that inspired the poem and the song Strange Fruit. And it took place in Indiana. And not one of the places perhaps that was known for lynchings, but definitely one of the most famous incidents of all time. Now, the interesting thing about this photograph is that there are two men hanging from a tree in this photograph. There were supposed to be three. So I'm going to read the article to you real quick and tell you the story of this third man who escaped this terrible fate and, exactly the legacy of that. So the title of the article is Strange Fruit, Anniversary of a Lynching. It was an NPR article from 2010. 80 years ago, two young African-American men, Thomas Shipp and Abram Smith, were lynched in the town center of Marion, Indiana. The night before, on August 6, 1930, they had been arrested and charged with the armed robbery and murder of a white factory worker, Claude Dieter, and the rape of his companion, Mary Ball. That evening, local police were unable to stop a mob of thousands from breaking into the jail with sledgehammers and crowbars to pull the young men out of their cells and lynch them. News of the lynching spread across the world. Local photographer Lawrence Beitler took what would become the most iconic photograph of lynching in America. The photograph shows two bodies hanging from a tree surrounded by a crowd of ordinary citizens, including women and children. Thousands of copies were made and sold. The photograph helped inspire the poem and song Strange Fruit, written by Abel Meeropol and performed around the world by Billie Holiday. But there was a third person, 16-year-old James Cameron, who narrowly survived the lynching. The mob grabbed Shipp and Smith first, and then came back for Cameron. He had a noose around his neck when he made an improbable escape. After 15 or 20 minutes of having their picture taken and everything, they came back to get me, Cameron told NPR in 1994. Just then the sheriff, and he was sweating like somebody had thrown a bucket of water in his face, he told the mob leader, "Get the hell out of here. You already hung two of them, so that ought to satisfy you." Then they began to yell for me, like a favorite basketball or football player. They said, "We want Cameron. We want Cameron. We want Cameron." And I looked over to the faces of the people as they were beating me along the way to the tree. I was pleading for some kind of mercy, looking for a kind face, but I could find none. They got me up to the tree, and they got a rope, and they put it around my neck, and they began to push me under the tree. And that's when I prayed to God. I said, "Lord, have mercy, forgive me my sins." I was ready to die. That's when some people say a local Marion citizen stood on the hood of his car and shouted, "He's innocent, he didn't do it." Whatever the cause, the mob decided not to lynch Cameron, and he was taken back to the jail. Cameron was moved out of town, convicted as an accessory to the murder, and served 4 years in jail. But the case was never solved. We know that 3 young black men were at the scene of the crime. We know there was also a young white woman at the scene of the crime. Who pulled the trigger, who shot Claude Dieter, is not known, and I don't think really can be known, says historian Jim Madison at Indiana University. After the lynching, Cameron became a very devout man and vividly describes this day in his autobiographical account, A Time of Terror. He believed that the voice that came from the crowd to save him was the voice of an angel. He also went on to found 3 chapters of the NAACP, served as Indiana's state director of the Office of Civil Liberties, and founded America's Black Holocaust Museum. In 1993, the governor of Indiana, Evan Bayh, formally pardoned Cameron. "When a traumatic event happens like that, it makes an indelible imprint on the mind," Cameron said. "But I told him, since Indiana had forgiven me, I, in turn, forgive Indiana." In 2005, James Cameron spoke at a press conference held by Senate members who passed a historic resolution apologizing for the body's failure to enact federal anti-lynching legislation during the first half of the 20th century. Cameron died on June 11th, 2006, at the age of 92. He is survived by his wife Virginia, 3 children, Virgil, Walter, and Dolores Cameron, and numerous grandchildren. So for James Cameron, who was only 16 at the time that this attempted lynching occurred, well, attempted for him, not so attempted for his friends, but in his case, his story had a happy-ish ending. He served 4 years in jail for a crime that he probably didn't commit, since he was formally pardoned many years later. But he escaped with his life. He was able to have a life, have a family. But for so many people during that time period, that was not the case. And unfortunately, lynchings were not just restricted to the time of the Great Depression. If you look into the case of Emmett Till, who was a young black teenager, he was murdered in 1955 for the crime of flirting with a white woman in Alabama. As recently as the 1980s, there have been confirmed lynchings again in Alabama. So for our book, which takes place in Alabama, this is a very, very real threat that any black man accused of violating a white woman would certainly be concerned about. Now, one thing I want to emphasize about this historical issue, I truly believe that America is, the greatest country in the world. But I also believe that every country makes mistakes. And in 2005, our Senate took steps towards trying to heal some of the trauma from this mistake. They apologized. Sometimes the first thing you need to do is just say sorry, even though none of those Senate members were in office at the time that lynchings were going on, even though none of them were personally involved in a lynching. They still said, our country made a mistake. There should have been legislation, there should have been laws cracking down on lynching, finding the people involved, making sure that people can't just murder human beings without due process and without consequences. So I think our country still needs to take steps, and we still need to know the ugliness that our country has been through and recognize it, so that we can have a better America. But anyways, so back to the fictional world of Tom Robinson. The next thing that I have in here, you can see, is a movie clip from chapter 15 of the book. Now, we will need to read a few pages to get to the point where the movie clip makes sense. They have a little bit more lead up in the book than they do in the movie. Now, for B-Day students, obviously those of you in class, we're going to read the pages and we'll watch the clip in class. For any B-Day students who are absent, I'm going to read those pages with you now, and you can watch the clip. And I have it in 2 possible formats. So if this will not play for you, if the download will not play on there, I also have a link to a YouTube video that will show you most of the clip. It cuts out like the very beginning and the very end, but most of it is there. Now, for A-Day students, you do not have to watch this clip, because what I'm going to be doing on Monday when A-Day students are in class is we are going to watch this clip that covers chapter 15, and we will also watch a clip that covers chapters 16 through 21. So those 2 combined will take up most of our Monday. I wanted to make sure everyone had the chance to see this section of the book, because it is such an important section, and the movie does a really good job of bringing it to life. So the only reason you really want to watch this clip is if you are a B-Day student who is absent on this day in class. A-Day students, once I finish reading the beginning of chapter 15, you are welcome to wait. If you can't wait the whole weekend to find out what happens to Tom Robinson, then the clip is there for you so that you aren't left, on a cliffhanger. But we will watch this clip in class just in case it didn't work for anybody at home. So now I'm going to switch over to chapter 15, which takes place the weekend before Tom Robinson's trial. Now, the last big dramatic thing that we had in the book was the arrival of Dill, who really wasn't supposed to be in town, but, decided that he was going to come in town anyways, because that's Dill. So, anyways, chapter 15 begins just talking a little bit about that, but then things start to get tense. You can see at the beginning of this paragraph, Scout says, "A nightmare was upon us." So we're getting to kind of the main climax of the book where things really, really build up and, get a little crazy. So, all right, chapter 15. After many telephone calls, much pleading on behalf of the defendant, and a long, forgiving letter from his mother, it was decided that Dill could stay. We had a week of peace together. After that, little it seemed. A nightmare was upon us. It began one evening after supper. Dill was over. Aunt Alexandra was in her chair in the corner. Atticus was in his. Jem and I were on the floor reading. It had been a placid week. I had minded Auntie. Jem had outgrown the treehouse, but helped Dill and me construct a new rope ladder for it. Dill had hit upon a foolproof plan to make Boo Radley come out at no cost to ourselves, place a trail of lemon drops from the back door to the front yard, and he'd follow it like an ant. There was a knock on the front door. Jem answered it and said it was Mr. Heck Tate. "Well, ask him to come in," said Atticus. "I already did. There's some men outside in the yard. They want you to come out." In Macomb, grown men stood outside in the front yard for only 2 reasons: death and politics. I wondered who had died. Jem and I went to the front door, but Atticus called, "Go back in the house." Jem turned out the living room lights and pressed his nose to a window screen. Aunt Alexandra protested. "Just for a second, Auntie, let's see who it is," he said. Dill and I took another window. A crowd of men was standing around Atticus. They all seemed to be talking at once. "Moving him to the county jail tomorrow," Mr. Tate was saying. "I don't look for any trouble, but I can't guarantee there won't be any." "Don't be foolish, Heck," Atticus said. "This is Macomb." Said I was just uneasy. "Heck, we've gotten one postponement of this case just to make sure there's nothing to be uneasy about. This is Saturday," Atticus said. "Trial'll probably be Monday. You can keep him one night, can't you? I don't think anybody in Macomb will begrudge me a client with times this hard." There was a murmur of glee that died suddenly when Mr. Link D said, "Nobody around here's up to anything. It's that old Sarum bunch I'm worried about. Can't you get what is it, Heck?" "Change of venue," said Mr. Tate. "Not much point in that, now is it?" Atticus said something inaudible. I turned to Jim, who waved me to silence. "Besides," Atticus was saying, "you're not scared of that crowd, are you?" "Know how they do when they get shinned up." "They don't usually drink on Sunday. They go to church most of the day," Atticus said. "This is a special occasion, though," someone said. They murmured and buzzed until Auntie said if Jim didn't turn on the living room lights, he would disgrace the family. Jim didn't hear her. "Don't see why you touched it in the first place," Mr. Linkdees was saying. "You've got everything to lose from this, Atticus. I mean everything." "Do you really think so?" This was Atticus's dangerous question. "Do you really think you want to move there, Scout?" Bam, 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 and the checkerboard was swept clean of my men. "Do you really think that, son? Then read this." Jem would struggle the rest of an evening through the speeches of Henry W. Grady. "Link, that boy might go to the chair, but he's not going till the truth's told." Atticus's voice was even. "And you know what the truth is." There was a murmur among the group of men, made more ominous when Atticus moved back to the front step and the men drew nearer to him. Suddenly Jem screamed, "Atticus, the telephone's ringing!" The men jumped a little and scattered. They were people we saw every day. Merchants, in-town farmers. Dr. Reynolds was there. So was Mr. Avery. "We'll answer it, son," called Atticus. Laughter broke them up. When Atticus switched on the overhead light in the living room, he found Jem at the window, pale except for the vivid mark of the screen on his nose. "Why on earth are you all sitting in the dark?" he asked. Jem watched him go to his chair and pick up the evening paper. I sometimes think Atticus subjected every crisis of his life to tranquil evaluation behind the Mobile Register, the Birmingham News, and the Montgomery Advertiser. "They were after you, weren't they?" Jem went to him. "They wanted to get you, didn't they?" Atticus lowered the paper and gazed at Jem. "What have you been reading?" he asked. Then he said gently, "No, son, those were our friends. It wasn't a gang?" Jem was looking from the corners of his eyes. Atticus tried to stifle a smile, but didn't make it. "No, we don't have mobs and that nonsense in Macomb. I've never heard of a gang in Macomb. Ku Klux got after some Catholics one time." "Never heard of Catholics in Macomb either," said Atticus. "You're confusing that with something else. Way back about 1920 there was a Klan, but it was a political organization more than anything. Besides, they couldn't find anybody to scare. They paraded by Mr. Sam Levy's house one night, but Sam just stood on his porch and told 'em things had come to a pretty pass. He'd sold 'em the very sheets on their backs. Sam made 'em so ashamed of themselves they went away. The Levy family met all the criteria for being fine folks. They did the best they could with the sense they had, and they'd been living on the same plot of ground in Macomb for 5 generations. "Ku Klux is gone," said Atticus. "It'll never come back." I walked home with Dill and returned in time to overhear Atticus saying to Auntie, "In favor of Southern womanhood as much as anybody, but not for preserving polite fiction at the expense of human life," a pronouncement that made me suspect they had been fussing again. I sought Jim and found him in his room, on the bed deep in thought. "Have they been at it?" I asked. "Sort of. She won't let him alone about Tom Robinson. She almost said Atticus was disgracing the family. Scout, I'm scared." "Scared of what?" "Scared about Atticus. Somebody might hurt him." Jim preferred to remain mysterious. All he would say to my questions was go on and leave him alone. Next day was Sunday. In the interval between Sunday school and church, when the congregation stretched its legs, I saw Atticus standing in the yard with another knot of men. Mr. Hectate was present, and I wondered if he had seen the light. He never went to church. Even Mr. Underwood was there. Mr. Underwood had no use for any organization but the Macomb Tribune, of which he was the sole owner, editor, and printer. His days were spent at his linotype, where he refreshed himself occasionally from an ever-present gallon jug of cherry wine. He rarely gathered news. People brought it to him. It was said that he made up every edition of the Macomb Tribune out of his own head and wrote it down on the linotype. This was believable. Something must have been up to haul Mr. Underwood out. I caught Atticus coming in the door, and he said they'd moved Tom Robinson to the Macomb jail. He also said, more to himself than to me, that if they'd kept him there in the first place, there wouldn't have been any fuss. I watched him take his seat on the third row from the front, and I heard him rumble, "Nearer, my God, to thee," some notes behind the rest of us. He never sat with Auntie, Jim, and me. He liked to be by himself in church. The fake peace that prevailed on Sundays was made more irritating by Aunt Alexandra's presence. Atticus would flee to his office directly after dinner, or if we sometimes looked in on him, we would find him sitting back in his swivel chair reading. Aunt Alexandra composed herself for a 2-hour nap and dared us to make any noise in the yard. The neighborhood was resting. Jim, in his old age, had taken to his room with a stack of football magazines, so Dill and I spent our Sundays creeping around in Deer's pasture. Shooting on Sundays was prohibited, so Dill and I kicked Jim's football around the pasture for a while, which was no fun. Dill asked if I'd like to have a poke at Boo Radley. I said I didn't think it'd be nice to bother him, and spent the rest of the afternoon filling Dill in on last winter's events. He was considerably impressed. We parted at supper time, and after our meal Jem and I were settling down to a routine evening when Atticus did something that interested us. He came into the living room, carrying a long electrical extension cord. There was a light bulb on the end. "I'm going out for a while," he said. "You folks will be in bed when I come back, so I'll say good night now." With that, he put his hat on and went out the back door. "He's taken the car," said Jim. Our father had a few peculiarities. One was, he never ate desserts. Another was that he liked to walk. As far back as I could remember, there was always a Chevrolet in excellent condition in the car house, and Atticus put many miles on it in business trips, but in Macomb he walked to and from his office 4 times a day, covering about 2 miles. He said his only exercise was walking. In Macomb, if one went for a walk with no definite purpose in mind, it was correct to believe one's mind incapable of definite purpose. Later on, I bade my aunt and brother good night and was well into a book when I heard Jim rattling around in his room. His go-to-bed noises were so familiar to me that I knocked on his door. "Why ain't you going to bed?" "Going downtown for a while." He was changing his pants. "Why? It's almost 10 o'clock, Jim." He knew it, but he was going anyway. "Then I'm going with you. And if you say no you're not, I'm going anyway here." Jim saw that he would have to fight me to keep me home, and I suppose he thought a fight would antagonize Auntie, so he gave in with little grace. I dressed quickly. We waited until Auntie's light went out, and we walked quietly down the back steps. There was no moon tonight. "Dill'll want to come," I whispered. "So he will," said Jim gloomily. We leaped over the driveway wall, cut through Miss Rachel's side yard, and went to Dill's window. Jim whistled Bob White. Dill's face appeared at the screen, disappeared, and 5 minutes later he unhooked the screen and crawled out. An old campaigner, he did not speak until we were on the sidewalk. "What's up?" "Jim's got the look-arounds," an affliction Calpurnia said all boys caught at his age. "I've just got this feeling," Jim said. "Just this feeling." All right, so that's where I'm gonna stop us, right after feeling. Jim has a bad feeling. Jim's had bad feelings most of this chapter. And at this point, if you are a B-Day student who was absent from class, feel free to go ahead and switch over to the movie clip. If you are an A-Day person, you can either wait until Monday and we'll watch the clip then, or you can go ahead and view it. It's just a few minutes if you're curious about what's going on. I'm sure, given the information that I gave you before we read this chapter and the hints that have been going on, you can probably kind of see where this is going. Tom Robinson, up until now, has been kept in the state jail, which is in a different location in Alabama, to protect him. Now, since this is the night before the trial, he has been moved to the Macomb County Jail, this local jail, so that it's easier for him to get to the courthouse for his trial that he's supposed to be going to tomorrow. But given the recent events and given the group of men outside of Atticus's house, we're kind of thinking that something might happen the night before the trial that perhaps would prevent Tom Robinson from being able to, testify in his own defense. So Jim, when he saw that group of men outside, was like, "Oh my gosh, it's a gang, they're here to get Atticus." And Atticus said, "No, no, 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 that's not right. These men are our friends." So we're realizing that the threat was not to Atticus, but they were worried about a threat to Tom. So Mr. Heck Tate, who is the town sheriff, other men in the community, in the neighborhood, they were coming to Atticus and saying, "Atticus, I know you're defending this man in a court of law, but he might not make it there." So what you are about to see is a scene outside of the jail, which is where the kids are headed. So Jim, Dill, and Scout, these poor little innocent children, are about to go outside the jail, check on Atticus, and they're going to get there in time to see a very serious thing about to happen. So that's what I'll leave you with, and if you choose to watch the clip, go for it. And if you want to wait till Monday when we watch it in class, then just prepare yourself for a very tense scene. So that is all for today's lesson.